Thank you very much. This award recognizes that person who, in spite of their addiction to drugs or to alcohol, have managed to stay in recovery and go on to make a significant contribution to society.
He is kind to children who seem to have an instinctive trust of him. In his hometown of Souk, BC, everyone seems to know him. Andre Spencer, counselor, spiritual healer. Andre Spencer, former street prostitute and drug addict. He was born on the Three Points Reservation in Quebec and had left home by the time he was 14 years old. At the time, he had decided he was neither accepted by his family nor accepting of his heritage. The Indian school he attended was an abusive place, both physical and sexual, and his earliest memories are of a priest holding him face down in the dirt of the schoolyard and screaming at him that he was worthless. Andre will tell you that no one is ready for the world at 14. To survive, he sold his body for money. To survive his nightmares, he began to take drugs. And he was angry at his family for not accepting him, at his heritage and culture for the stigma he felt these attached to him. He blamed society for his failures, depression, and pain. At 28, he moved to British Columbia, severing all contact with his family. By 33, life was intolerable. He had no hope at all. On a morning he will never forget, he drove his car to the desert wilderness behind the tiny town of Vesuvius. At the end of a long and isolated logging road, sitting alone in his car, not eating, suspended in a world between reality and dreams, Andre ingested massive amounts of drugs. By that time, he was taking the equivalent of 78 Tylenol 3s every day. When the drugs were gone, Andre got out of the car and began to run. Fueled by amphetamines, chased by demons, he ran until his legs gave out, and then he collapsed. Alone, too far from his car to even think of returning. For the next 2 weeks, he ate nothing but berries and roots. He built a sweat lodge, and as the drugs sweated out of him, he began to communicate with the Great Spirit. In that way, he began to heal. 2 weeks later, he walked back to his car, for the first time in 19 years, drug-free. On that day, he began a journey of spiritual awakening, finally embracing the ancient culture that he had shunned for so long. He married, and his beautiful daughter, Dani, was born. He traveled, he studied. Since 1982, he has worked as a counselor in Victoria, first with the general population and then progressing to First Nations individuals who had been labeled as hopeless or incurable by the medical establishment. He acknowledges his God-given gift as a healer. His healing circles are well known and well respected. He solves modern problems with ancient wisdom. After more than 30 years, he is at peace with himself and in touch with his family. It is the source of his most profound joy. You see, as he explains it, his journey towards well-being began when he began to forgive the people in his life for all the hurts, both real and imagined. He forgave his schooling, he forgave his family, he forgave us, he forgave himself. And today, Andre fights to help others find the strength to confront their demons. He knows some of them will win and some of them will not. But it is not the winning that will count. It is in never losing hope. Andre Spencer fights to give them hope with hard-won knowledge and the scars of his experience, so that others might have, as he has, the courage to come back.
Ladies and gentlemen, the 1999 Courage to Come Back Award recipient for chemical dependency, Andre Spencer.
Hi. I'd like to thank the Creator for the lessons in my life and the gifts that I've been given. I'd like to thank the Coast Foundation. To tell you the truth, I knew very little about it until recently, and especially after tonight's presentation. I truly believe that whoever started the Coast Foundation was definitely Indian. Well, the reason why is because in our Aboriginal ancestors, we always regarded anyone who was mentally ill or whatever, touched by the Great Spirit, and we held them in high regard, and we always wanted to be near them because they were special. And that's what the Coast Foundation represents to me. I'd like to thank Shirley Broadfoot. She brought my daughter here, and thank you, Shirley. I would like to thank someone who should be getting this award, Lenny Gagnon, special lady. Lenny, couldn't use your feather. I didn't smudge it yet, but I love it. I don't know where you are. Ah, cool. I would also like to thank Mary Coakley, my bestest friend and special friend, for coming and supporting me. And I really want to thank the other recipients, Pam, Lauren, April, and especially Tina, holding my hand back there when they were talking about the school stuff. It was hard. They made me feel, last night at the game, they made me feel like really connected to them and warm and comforting and like I'd known them for a long time. And they're really special, really special. You saw pretty well a lot of my own story up there, so I don't want to dwell on the past. But one of the things that I'm heard that I do best is tell stories. And I tell stories, legends or whatever, we use those always to get our points across. That was the whole point in our tradition, that's the way it was. And one that one that I wanted to tell was, they're not necessarily Indian legends, but they're legends nevertheless, because all cultures have good stories. But Lauren, I know you're back there, and this one's for you, because you mentioned something about the Last Supper last night. This is, we just had the great showing of Leonardo da Vinci in Victoria, and there's a legend that I always used of Leonardo da Vinci, and it's a story that it takes place when he decided to do the painting of the Last Supper. And the legend states that it took him 20 years to do this painting, and that's a long time for any painting. But they said the reason why it took so long was because he studied the characteristics, personalities, and descriptions of all the apostles. And he wanted to find people who would best match them so he could be as accurate as possible. With that information in hand, he went out searching, and the first person he saw was this beautiful young man. And as soon as he saw him, he says, "That's my Jesus." So he went up and asked this young man if he'd pose for him. And the young man said, sure. So Leonardo took him to his studio, sat him down, and proceeded to paint him as Jesus. After he was done, he thanked the young man, and the young man went on his way. Over the next 9 years, he painted the other apostles, each their turn, Peter, Paul, the rest of them. The last one that was left to paint was Judas, of course. And he knew he was looking for somebody, that looked like they'd sell their own mother. But he searched and he searched, and he searched for another 9 years, 10 years. And finally it happened one day when he was walking down one of the streets in Venice, and he looked in this window. It was a place with like Salvation Army, you get free meals when you're down and out, or maybe the Coast Foundation. Anyway, he saw this guy eating, and he said, that's my Judas. So he went in and asked the fellow if he'd pose for him. The guy said, well, what's in it for me? And Leonardo took out, some money and a few lira, and said, this is all I have. And the guy said, well, okay, So Leonardo took him to his studio and started painting him as Judas. And as he was painting him, the fellow had tears in his eyes, started crying. And Leonardo asked him what was wrong. And he said, you're painting me as Judas. He says, yeah, that's how I see you. He said, but I remember when you painted me as Jesus. And this one's for Keith, who wrote the story. I'll tell you one more. This is the story that I used, the bottom line of what life is all about, because there was a time in my life where I thought it was either the world or myself, and I wanted to know which. And this is a story about a preacher who procrastinated all week writing his sermon. Finally, Saturday comes along, he's like, I got to get this done. So he starts writing his sermon, but as soon as he gets started, his 10-year-old boy comes up and says, Dad, I'm bored, can you play with me? So trying to be a good father, he plays with his son. After a while, he says, son, you got to go out and play. I got to get my work done. But inevitably, the son kept coming and interrupting him, like sons do. Finally, out of desperation, the preacher looked around the room and says, I got to find something to occupy his time so I can get this done. And he noticed on the table there was a picture about the size of a placemat. And he looked at it. It was a picture of a map of the world. So he got an idea. He got a pair of scissors and cut it up into a puzzle. When his son came in, he said, look, son, I made you a puzzle. He said, can you put it together for me? He says, it's a picture of the world. He said, sure, Dad. So the little boy sits down, starts working on the puzzle. Preacher goes and sits and starts working on the sermon, thinking, good. Give me an hour and a half, I'll get this done. 10 minutes later, the little boy comes up and says, I'm all done, Dad. He says, what? He says, yeah, see? He says, how'd you do that so fast? He says, I turned one of the pieces over, and I noticed on the other side there was a picture of a man, so I put the man together. But when the man was okay, the world was okay. Thank you. All right.